the human relic hunter. Chapter 8, Echoes of a Dying Star. The vault's dim lighting flickered sporadically, casting shifting shadows across the ancient metal walls. The faint hum of machinery struggling to maintain power was the only sound, aside from the distant hiss of venting gases and the occasional flicker of failing systems. Nancy Calloway stood at the central control console, her arms crossed, jaw tight, as she examined the sputtering readouts. She ran her fingers across the console, activating a series of diagnostic commands. The holographic interface responded sluggishly, its once bright displays now faded and fragmented. "It wasn't like this when we built it," she muttered under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. "This thing was designed to last millennia, not barely hang on by a thread." Durin hovered nearby, his arms folded and antennae twitching with mild impatience. "Yeah, well, it's been 50,000 years. Maybe you should give it some slack," he quipped. Nancy shot him a glare sharp enough to cut through steel. 50,000 years is nothing when it's supposed to be self-sustaining. Someone clearly didn't bother with the upkeep. She turned her attention to the towering sentinel, standing motionless beside the console. "Maintenance protocols?" she asked sharply. "Unnecessary," the sentinel replied in its deep, monotonous tone. The vault was designed to operate autonomously without intervention. Nancy rolled her eyes. "Yeah, and look how well that turned out." She tapped a blinking red indicator on the console. "Power output from the star is dropping faster than expected. The energy grid is overloaded and the fail-safes are barely holding. If this keeps up, the entire system will collapse." Durin stepped closer, peering at the holographic display with a skeptical expression. "So what's the plan? Slap some duct tape on it and hope for the best?" "If only it were that simple," Nancy snapped back. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "The sun is failing. It can't support the vault's energy demands anymore. We need an alternative power source." Seraph's voice crackled over the comms from the Wanderer 2. "Oh, splendid. The universe's most advanced vault, and it comes down to a power failure. Perhaps try turning it off and on again." Nancy didn't miss a beat. "Since I'm taking your ship to retrieve a new core, maybe you should be quiet." For the first time, Seraph went silent. Durin blinked, clearly impressed. "Wow. You actually shut him up." Nancy allowed herself a small, satisfied smirk. "It's a gift." She turned back to the console, fingers dancing over the controls as she accessed the vault's star charts and inventory logs. After a moment, the holographic display shifted, highlighting a large, derelict object floating in the debris field above the planet. "There," she said, pointing at the blinking marker. "TSV Wrath of Ares, a Terran battleship from the final days of the war. If its core is still intact, it could power the vault for centuries." Durin squinted at the display. "And let me guess, it's surrounded by debris, probably half broken, and crawling with things that want to kill us." "Most likely," Nancy replied without missing a beat. "Which is why we're going. You, me, and Bolt," Durin groaned. "Of course we are." As they gathered their gear, Durin shot her a sideways glance. "You know, technically I found the vault. Maybe I should be the one giving orders." Nancy paused, looking at him with an arched brow. "Oh, sure. Because stumbling into ancient death traps qualifies as leadership experience. Let me guess. Your grand strategy is to wing it and hope for the best?" Durin opened his mouth to respond, then closed it with a huff. "I hate how fast you are at that." "Get used to it," she shot back, slinging a toolkit over her shoulder. Bolt chirped cheerfully. "Team cohesion, improving." Nancy chuckled softly, shaking her head. "If that's what you call this, I'd hate to see what dysfunctional looks like." Just as they reached the hangar bay, the vault shuddered violently. The lights flickered, alarms blaring throughout the chamber. Nancy spun around, her instincts sharp. "What the hell was that?" Durin shouted over the noise. The sentinel's voice echoed through the chaos. "Power surge detected. Cryopod systems failing." They raced back to the control room, where holographic readouts flashed with urgent warnings. Several cryopods were blinking red, their life support systems failing one by one. Nancy's heart raced as she scanned the data. "Damn it! We're out of time." Nancy grabbed her plasma rifle from the vault's armory, checking the power cell with practiced efficiency. Durin followed suit, muttering about how he never needed one of these until she showed up. She grabbed Durin by the arm, pulling him toward the ship. "Let's move. Now, if we don't get that core, they're all dead." The vault's hum grew weaker with each passing second. like the final fading breath of something ancient and dying. The Wanderer 2 roared to life, its engines vibrating beneath Durin's feet as he secured himself in the pilot's seat. Nancy settled into the co-pilot's chair with Bolt tucked securely near the navigation console. The interior lights flickered momentarily, a subtle reminder that this ship, though advanced, was still running on borrowed time. Through the viewport, the vault receded, its structure silhouetted against the dim glow of the dying star. The faint pulsing light was a grim metronome, counting down the precious minutes they had left to save the cryo-sleepers. Durin clenched the controls, guiding the Wanderer 2 into the debris field that loomed ahead, the scattered remnants of humanity's final stand against the Drac. Nancy's gaze was fixed on the twisted wreckage drifting like ghosts in the void. The shattered husks of Terran ships floated silently, their hulls torn open, revealing skeletal remains of what once were proud vessels. Some still bore the scorched marks of battle, others twisted from explosive decompressions. "This was supposed to be our last stand," Nancy muttered, her voice low. "The line we swore we'd never let them cross." Durin glanced sideways, noting the shift in her demeanor. The sharp sarcasm had faded, replaced by something colder, a haunted edge in her voice. "Looks like that plan worked out great," he said, attempting levity. It fell flat. Nancy didn't respond immediately. Her eyes tracked the debris, pausing on a mangled Terran cruiser with the remnants of a faded insignia still visible. Flashback. She was back in the heat of battle, the deafening roar of explosions shaking the ground beneath her boots. The acrid smell of burning metal and plasma filled the air as her squad advanced through a crumbling facility. She remembered the adrenaline, the cold precision of her team moving in unison, her hands steady on her rifle as they fought not just for survival, but for the faint hope that humanity could win. End flashback. Nancy snapped back to the present, jaw clenched. "Focus," she whispered to herself. The Wanderer 2 approached the wreckage of the TSV Wrath of Ares. The battleship was a massive shadow against the starlight, its hull scarred and broken, pieces of its armor drifting lazily around it. Its once formidable silhouette was marred by gaping wounds where the Drac had torn through Terran defenses like paper. "There she is," Durin muttered. "Big, ugly, and probably filled with things that want to kill us." "Sounds like every place I've ever worked," Nancy replied dryly. They suited up, securing their helmets with audible clicks as the airlock cycled. The seals engaged with a hiss, confirming their suits were airtight. They docked with the ship's secondary airlock, the magnetic clamps locking into place with a hollow thud. The transition was seamless, but the tension in the cabin was anything but. Durin stood first, checking his gear. "All right, we go in, grab the core, and get out. No heroics." Nancy gave him a flat look through her visor. "Define heroics!" Bolt chirped, his optics blinking. "Probability of encountering hostiles. High." Durin groaned. "Great. Thanks, Bolt." They cycled through the airlock, stepping into the belly of the Wrath of Ares. The interior was a graveyard. The once sterile military corridors were now coated in frost, debris floating in the zero-gravity environment. The flickering emergency lights cast eerie shadows, illuminating frozen bodies of Terran soldiers suspended in death, still strapped into harnesses or drifting with expressions of determination or fear frozen on their faces. Durin exhaled slowly. "This place gives me the creeps." Nancy's face was unreadable behind her helmet as she navigated through the debris, her movements precise, almost mechanical. "Keep moving," she said. "We're not here to mourn the past." As they progressed deeper into the ship, the environmental hazards became more pronounced. A collapsed bulkhead forced them to squeeze through jagged openings, while sudden bursts of decompression hissed from ruptured pipes. Bolt's stabilizers hissed as he adjusted, keeping pace effortlessly. They reached the reactor corridor, its reinforced blast doors partially open, distorted by heat damage from an ancient explosion. Nancy squeezed through first, her suit's external lights casting narrow beams across the scarred metal. "Almost there," she whispered. As they approached the reactor chamber, a faint hum grew louder, subtle at first, then rising in pitch. Red lights flickered to life, and Durin's instincts screamed a warning. Nancy?" Too late. Automated defense drones activated, their optics flashing as they unfolded from hidden compartments in the walls. They targeted the intruders with mechanical precision, their weapon systems charging. "Move!" Nancy shouted, diving for cover as plasma bolts erupted down the corridor. streaks of searing plasma cutting through the dim, flickering lights. Nancy barely hit the ground in time, her suit's impact dampeners absorbing the worst of the shock as she rolled behind a twisted bulkhead. Durin wasn't as graceful. He stumbled, tripping over floating debris, and crashed awkwardly against a wall panel, cursing in 3 different languages. "Bolt suppression!" Nancy barked, her voice sharp over the comms. Bolt responded instantly, deploying a small retractable arm equipped with a compact plasma blaster. The drone fired precise bursts, forcing the defense drones to retreat momentarily behind cover. The reprieve was brief, but it was enough. Nancy pushed up onto one knee, her rifle already in position. She squeezed the trigger, sending a rapid burst of plasma bolts into the nearest drone. The shot struck true, hitting its optic sensor and causing it to spiral into a bulkhead, sparks flying as it crumpled. "Durin, flank left!" she shouted. Durin groaned, pulling himself upright. "Flank left," she says. "Like that's easy when you're being shot at." Still, he followed orders, skirting the debris-strewn corridor, his own blaster firing wildly. Most of his shots missed, but one lucky hit clipped a drone's propulsion system, sending it spinning out of control until it crashed against the ceiling. "Ha! See that?" Durin whooped. "Tactical genius right here." "Less celebrating, more shooting," Nancy snapped, rolling from cover to cover with fluid precision. She was a machine, moving, aiming, firing with ruthless efficiency. Every motion honed by years of training, muscle memory kicking in like she'd never left the battlefield. The drones regrouped, adapting their attack patterns. They advanced with chilling synchronization, weapons recalibrated for precision strikes. One of them fired a concentrated plasma burst that barely missed Bolt, the heat distorting the air in its wake. "Hostiles adapting," Bolt reported, his voice as calm as ever despite the chaos. Nancy gritted her teeth. "Then we adapt faster." She switched to a concussive grenade, priming it with swift efficiency before lobbing it into the center of the advancing drones. The explosion was muted in the vacuum-sealed environment but devastating in effect. Shrapnel and twisted metal filled the corridor, and when the smoke cleared, only 2 drones remained. Durin surged forward, emboldened. "I got this!" He did not in fact have this. As he charged, blaster blazing, one of the drones pivoted with mechanical precision, firing a shot that clipped his shoulder. He spun midair, colliding with the wall and floating limply. "Durin!" Nancy shouted, vaulting over debris to reach him. She fired with brutal accuracy, disabling the last drones before sliding to his side. "I totally had that," Durin mumbled, groaning as he clutched his shoulder. "Sure you did," Nancy replied dryly, checking his suit for breaches. It was scorched but intact. With the immediate threat neutralized, they regrouped. The corridor was eerily silent again, save for the faint hum of emergency power systems struggling to keep the ship's remains functional. Nancy took a deep breath, letting the adrenaline settle. Then she spotted it, a partially intact console embedded in the wall, its screen flickering weakly. "Bolt, see if you can access that terminal," she ordered. Bolt rolled over, connecting to the console with a data probe. The screen brightened, revealing fragmented logs and corrupted files. "Accessing archived data," Bolt reported. "Recovering video logs." The screen flickered to life, displaying grainy footage. Terran soldiers in battered armor were fighting desperately in the ship's corridors, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. The sounds of battle echoed through the feed, blaster fire, shouted orders, and the terrifying screeches of Drak forces. Nancy watched, her jaw tight. Memories surged, unbidden. Flashback. She was back in the chaos, her squad pinned down under heavy fire. She remembered the weight of her rifle, the heat of the battle, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness as her team was cut down one by one. The mission had been simple: hold the line. But against the Drak there was no holding, only delaying the inevitable. And flashback. Nancy clenched her fists, forcing the images back. She turned away from the screen, her voice cold and sharp. "We're not here for ghosts. Let's find that core." They moved deeper into the ship, following Bolt's navigational prompts toward the reactor room. The air grew colder, the silence heavier. As they approached the reactor chamber, Bolt paused, his optics flickering. "Unusual data signature detected," he said. Nancy frowned. "Clarify!" Before Bolt could respond, alarms blared. Red lights flashed violently as a loud mechanical voice echoed through the ship. "Security breach detected. Initiating self-destruct sequence." Nancy spun on Bolt. "What did you do?" Accidental activation, Bolt replied calmly. Self-destruct countdown initiated. Estimated time to detonation, 10 minutes. Fantastic, Durin groaned, struggling to his feet. I hate this ship. Nancy didn't waste time arguing. Let's move. We're not leaving without that core. The countdown had begun. They sprinted down the corridor, the ship groaning ominously around them as structural supports shifted and fractured. Debris floated in the zero-gravity environment, forcing them to dodge panels, cables, and the occasional body, silent reminders of the ship's bloody past. Bolt sped ahead, his stabilizing arms extended to maintain control amidst the chaos. Reactor core, 30 meters ahead, he announced, his voice maddeningly calm against the backdrop of klaxons. The floor beneath them shuddered violently as an explosion echoed from somewhere deep within the ship. A support beam snapped free, spiraling toward Durin. Nancy reacted instinctively, grabbing his suit and yanking him out of the way just in time. Keep your head down, she barked. I'd love to, Durin snapped back, breathless. But gravity's kind of optional right now. Seraph's voice crackled over the comms from the Wanderer, too. I see the self-destruct is going well. Should I start preparing your eulogies, or would you prefer something more optimistic? Nancy ignored him, focusing instead on the task at hand. They reached the reactor chamber, a vast, cylindrical room dominated by the dim glow of the ship's failing energy core. Fractured conduits sparked intermittently, and thick cables floated like metallic vines in the zero-gravity environment. Bolt, get to the control terminal. Durin, cover him, Nancy ordered, her voice sharp and steady. Bolt zipped toward the main console, connecting to the ancient Terran interface with practiced ease. His optics flickered rapidly as he accessed the ship's systems. Multiple security layers detected, Bolt reported. Attempting to override! Nancy moved to the core itself, inspecting the stabilization clamps. Her hands were steady, but inside her mind raced, calculating the time left, the odds of success, and the looming weight of failure. Another explosion rocked the ship, this time closer. A bulkhead snapped loose, slamming into the reactor chamber wall and sending a shower of sparks across the room. Durin ducked instinctively. I'm starting to think we should have just pulled the plug and run. Cowardice noted, Seraph quipped dryly. Nancy didn't respond. She was too busy rerouting power conduits, her fingers working with mechanical precision. Her mind drifted briefly to the past, to a mission not unlike this one, where she'd lost her entire team trying to secure a failing station during the Drac invasion. Flashback. Screams echoed in her ears as explosions tore through metal walls. She remembered dragging a wounded comrade through collapsing corridors, promising they'd make it out. But they hadn't. She had, though, and that guilt had followed her even into cryosleep. End flashback. Nancy? Durin's voice pulled her back. You okay? She shook her head sharply, clearing the memory. Focus. We're almost there, Bolt chirped. Override successful. Self-destruct sequence paused. A breath Nancy didn't realize she was holding escaped, but the relief was short-lived. Secondary security protocol active, Bolt continued. Countdown will resume unless core is stabilized. Nancy gritted her teeth. Then we stabilize it. She and Durin worked in tandem, securing the core's stabilizers while Bolt managed the control systems. Despite the chaos, there was an unexpected rhythm to their movements, a rough, chaotic harmony that somehow worked. As they locked the final stabilizer into place, the countdown display flickered. Self-destruct disabled. They all exhaled simultaneously, the tension releasing like a pressure valve. Durin collapsed against a wall, panting. Remind me never to do that again, he groaned. Nancy allowed herself a small, exhausted smile. Noted, but just as they began to relax, Bolt's optics flashed red. Unintended signal detected, he announced. Long-range distress beacon activated. Nancy's blood ran cold. Shut it down, now! Bolt interfaced quickly, disabling the beacon. Signal active for approximately 2 seconds, he reported. 2 seconds is all it takes, Seraph muttered grimly. Nancy stared at the console, her heart racing. Somewhere out there, something had heard them, and it was probably coming. The silence after Bolt's announcement was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the secured energy core and the distant groans of the dying wrath of Ares. The gravity of what had just happened lingered in the stale air of the derelict ship, a silent acknowledgement that a beacon had been lit, however briefly, and somewhere in the vastness of space, it may have been heard. We have the core. Let's not stick around to see who RSVP'd, Nancy muttered, her voice tight as she secured the final clamps around the core for transport. Durin didn't argue. For once, he was uncharacteristically quiet, the weight of their narrow escape from disaster pressing down like the ship's failing hull. The journey back to the Wanderer 2 was tense but uneventful. The silence between them felt heavier than the cargo they hauled, punctuated only by the rhythmic hiss of their suits' life support systems. Once aboard, the ship detached from the wrath of Ares, leaving the battered relic of humanity's past to drift once more in the void, its secrets mostly intact, but not all of them. As they broke free from the debris field and set a course back to the vault, Nancy sat quietly in the co-pilot's seat, staring at the faint blinking light on the console where the distress beacon had briefly flared to life. Seraph's voice eventually broke the silence. For the record, I'd like to point out that initiating a galactic distress signal was not on the mission checklist. Nancy didn't even glance at the comm panel. And yet here we are. Durin snorted from the pilot's seat. Yeah, thanks for the reminder, Seraph. We were dangerously close to forgetting about that whole possibly doomed the galaxy part. The rest of the flight passed in strained silence, until the vault loomed once again outside the viewport, its structure still bathed in the weak glow of the dying star. The landing was rough, but uneventful, and they wasted no time hauling the energy core into the vault's control chamber. Nancy worked with the kind of precision that came from years of training, her movements efficient, her focus razor-sharp. The Sentinel observed silently as she interfaced the new core with the vault's ancient systems. Lights flickered, systems rebooted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the vault hummed with stable power. Core installed. Power stabilized, Nancy announced, stepping back from the console. The relief was overwhelming. The soft hum of machinery filled the chamber, a stark contrast to the alarms and chaos of the past days. Durin let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Well, that wasn't so bad. Nancy shot him a look. We nearly died. Twice. Details, Durin replied with a shrug. For a brief moment there was peace. No alarms, no hostile drones, no failing systems. Just the steady, reassuring hum of life being sustained. Later, in the dim quiet of the control room, Nancy sat alone, staring at the vault's holographic display. Durin approached, leaning against the console beside her. Couldn't sleep? He asked. Didn't try, she replied, her gaze distant. I keep thinking about the signal. Durin was silent for a moment, then said, You did what you had to do. We all did. Nancy nodded slowly. But what if that was the wrong call? What if we woke something up that was better left sleeping? Durin considered this. Then we deal with it, like we always do. Nancy glanced at him, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. You're annoyingly optimistic for a guy who spends most of his time complaining. Survival instinct, he replied with a grin. Keeps me from spiraling into existential dread. She chuckled softly, shaking her head. Then her expression grew serious again. Do you ever wonder if humanity deserves to come back? She asked quietly. After everything we did, everything we lost, maybe we were meant to stay gone. Durin was quiet for a long moment before replying. I don't know if anyone deserves anything, but I do know that giving up isn't in humanity's nature. You survived. They survived. He gestured toward the cryochambers. Maybe that's enough, Seraph chimed in then, his voice as dry as ever. Philosophy from Durin. Truly, we are in the end times. Nancy laughed softly, the tension easing just a little. Thanks, Seraph. Always good to have your input. The laughter faded into a comfortable silence. They sat there for a while, staring at the vault, at the fragile hope it represented, and at the countless lives depending on them. The vault was stable. They were alive, but the signal was out there, and they had no idea who or what had heard it.